Hello everyone, back today with another Marvel Legends review, and today I'm going to be looking at the X-Men Retro Wave Avalanche figure. This is a pretty cool addition to the line because to date we've only had one other Avalanche figure in the line, and that was from Toy Biz a good few years ago in an X-Men line. Now, as much as I loved the Toy Biz years, one of the criticisms you could have of them was that sometimes they let their imaginations fly a little bit too much. They'd start to veer away from the source material and start to do their own thing, which would often be a little bit disappointing. And this version of Avalanche is a really good example of that. It's not too heinous in terms of being too exaggerated or too out there, but it's also distracting because it's not the Avalanche that I grew up with. It doesn't look quite right and it's just not authentic, and that's always a little bit disappointing. Suffice it to say then, this new version from Hasbro is a very welcome surprise. And surprising in the sense that we haven't had him before now, to be honest, because he is a major X-Men villain from the 80s. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been itching to get my hands on one of these for a long time. If we look at the packaging though, we can see of course it is part of that retro wave. They've essentially scaled up the kind of cards we used to see from Toy Biz way back in the 90s in their 5-inch scale line. So this is always really exciting. I actually don't think we got an Avalanche in that line originally, so this is a sort of reimagining, if you will, of what might have been. But I love this. I love that it's scaled up. I love this card art. I think they've chosen a really nice image there. And for anyone who grew up in the 90s who used to collect these figures, then this card art and this line will definitely appeal to your nostalgia. And I have to say as well, as a collector, I love being able to put these on display. They have these handy little peg holes there that you can put on your wall, and they look really colourful and fun. So even now, all these years later, I still think this is a great design. The nostalgic design is pretty consistent even when we flip the packaging over. It's pretty consistent with what we used to see back in the 90s. We have a little bit of bio about the character, which is always nice, but the best thing about this packaging, because there's an awful lot of small print here which is a bit distracting, but I really love the fact that this is part of a wave and we see the other figures that are available in this wave. This definitely takes me back, and this is always fun to see the other characters that you can complete your collection with. And if we take a closer look at some of these figures, we can see there's an awful lot of fan favourites in here, and I think the one that everyone is going to be desperate to get their hands on is Spiral. This is one I've already pre-ordered and is hopefully on its way to me as we speak, so I'll be looking forward to doing a review of that in a couple of weeks' time. But yeah, there's some great characters in here, and for me, Avalanche was probably the next best one because it's a character that I just didn't have in my collection before, and it's one I've much sought after. The figure himself is very bright and colourful. I really like the use of blue on this figure, and the silver they've used is a sort of metallic paint wash which works really quite well. And the overall sculpt looks really strong. Now, there's not an awful lot to comment on when it comes to the head sculpt because they have opted to sculpt his face with the mask over it, and sadly there isn't an alternate head that we can draw a lot of detail out from here. Now, one of the criticisms I have of this figure as a whole would be the complete lack of shading or paint apps that we'll see later on in the body as well, and I think that's a shame because it does lose a little bit of nuance and a little bit of detail that can make all the difference in these figures. Now, this is much more of a comic book accurate version of this character, which will please a lot of fans. It's pretty much his classic costume. The only thing that's missing is that big A on the chest, but he hasn't always had the A. And if we look at, say, an image from the animated X-Men series, which I grew up and I particularly love, and this is where I really know the character from in truth, we can see that the costume is close enough, so it could be a nice addition to your X-Men animated line, although the colouring is a little bit off. Clearly, he's got a deep blue rather than a lighter shade of grey here, which would have been employed otherwise. So this might be a tweak further down the line, and who knows, we might get that extra head at that point. I really like the overall sculpt of this figure, though all the parts look really meaty and strong, and they look roughly in proportion, which is great. So this looks really good to the eyes, it just looks really neat, which I like, and I think we have some new pieces here. Now, I may be mistaken, but this central torso piece with the flared shoulder pads there, this looks new. I don't think I've seen this on any other figures before. As I said, I really like the metallic paint that they've used for the main plastic body and on the gauntlets there. I think this looks really good. The only shame is, as I said, there's no shading whatsoever anywhere on the body, and I think if there'd just been something, a little wash running through the other parts of the sculpt, then this would have really made a big difference. Articulation wise, he has a ball joint in the head, so he can spin his head all the way around, but I noticed I couldn't really get the head to move up or down a great deal at all, and I'm not sure why. He has ball joints in the shoulders, so his arms pop out all the way, which is great, and of course there is a complementary bicep swivel, and as usual, the double jointed elbows. Now the only thing I wanted to comment on here is that these joints feel very rubbery and not the strongest. In fact, I have to be honest, straight after this video, one of these arms did snap off, and I've never had that before with any Marvel Legends figure, so that's a little bit disconcerting. There is a pin swivel at the wrist, of course that wrist rotates all the way around, and it hinges forwards and backwards as well. There's a swivel at the waist so we can turn from side to side, and of course there is an ab crunch as well, and this goes forwards and backwards a really good distance, so I'm very pleased with the articulation here. He's got ball joints in the hips, so the legs kick out to the side. There's an upper thigh swivel, and there's also a swivel at the top of the boot cut as well, which is pretty good and much appreciated. Likewise, those legs do kick forwards, they kick backwards, and of course there is a double jointed knee there as well, so you can kick that lower leg all the way back there. And then finally there is an ankle pivot, so that foot will hinge forwards and backwards and swivel from left to right. In terms of accessories, well, he's pretty light here. I've got to be honest, he just comes with an extra pair of open hands. This is very disappointing. I think it would have been great if they'd included an extra alternate head, like the head without the helmet, as I mentioned before. That would have been really good, and I think that would have been fine. The fact that he only comes with the extra pair of hands is a bit disappointing, especially for a figure at this increased price point. But despite that, he still cuts a really cool portrait, and I think having these choice of hands makes all the difference. So I really like this figure overall. In terms of a star rating, I'm probably only going to give it 3. And that's not to say I don't like the figure, but there's nothing extra special about it that makes me feel like I want to give it a 4 or a 5. He's very limited, as we know, when it comes to accessories, which is a bit disappointing. I also think the fact that his articulation in the head is so limited is surprising and again disappointing. The lack of paint wash over the figure to just really enhance what is a pretty cool sculpt, again disappointing. And then for me the biggest disappointment is the fact that his arm did snap off, which makes me wonder about the quality control. Now to be fair, it's very cold where I am now, so it's probably just a plastic reacting to that, but I did note that the joints feel quite rubbery, and I never liked that feeling in my action figures, and yeah, unfortunately he was a casualty of that. So overall, a little bit of a disappointment, but that said, I'm still really glad to have this figure in the collection. There's nothing really overtly wrong with it, provided your figure doesn't break the way mine did. And I think, you know, it's versatile enough that it could sit with your X-Men animated line or sit in your comic book collection, and I think he looks good in either place. And obviously, he's a much sought after character, long overdue a release, and so I'm very glad to have him in the collection. But there is this part of me that suspects we might be getting a souped up tweak a little bit later in the line. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.